Phil is a technology marketing professional with 10 years clean from drug addiction and lives with bipolar condition. He performs in an award-winning comedy show called Becoming More Less Crazy. I really want to hear about that. About his journey from mental health struggles to loving life, or at least liking it. He has appeared on the Moth Radio Hour and Comedy Central. He's a TED speaker, and he believes that talking about mental health should be easy. He serves as senior communications advisor for the Stability Network, an organization created to inspire and encourage people experiencing mental health challenges to thrive, and leads storytelling workshops and events for people impacted by mental health conditions.
So depression has a branding problem. No company, no business would say, hey, here's a new branding guidelines. We're going to use dark colors on a dreary background. We're going to show only pictures of people frowning in our ads. And we're going to play haunting, lonely music in our commercials. And whenever we talk about the product, we're going to use a really sad voice. Hi, I'm Bill Bernat, and I believe that by telling different stories about depression and mental health, uplifting stories, we can help people to climb mountains of stigma and hopelessness and see the other side where they can get help and live happier lives. As Juan mentioned, I have 10 years clean in recovery from drug addiction, and I live with bipolar disorder. I was inside of an exam room, inside of an emergency room, the first time that I was invited to stay in a hospital's locked behavioral health unit on suicide watch. And I didn't really understand the seriousness of the situation because I very politely declined. I thought, oh, that is so sweet of you. But I think I'm just going to go get a burger and fries and go home and watch TV. And then I noticed a guard outside the door, the little exam room. And I thought, well, now that's a weird place for that guy to take his break. Then my heart kind of sank as I realized he was guarding me. In the unit, I went and I talked to one of the admin staff and I said, hey, can you call my boss at the bank where I work in IT because we have this big project rollout and they need to know to delay it because I can't be on site. Well, she never made the call because she thought I was just imagining that I had a computer job at a bank. So when I went back to try to explain, she kind of brushed me off like I was a house cat that had jumped on the counter. And I mean, no disrespect to house cats. Their struggle is real. So I went and I talked to, during that same visit, I talked to a psychiatrist, bubbly person, smiley, lively, happy. And she treated me completely differently. She asked about my work. She talked to me as though I were her equal, her peer. And instead of talking about my depression in hushed tones, as though it were something to be embarrassed about, she made it seem as normal as like a broken foot or, and really just as treatable. So that little moment, right, that little moment really made an impression on me, so much so that 2 decades later, when I think about how that doctor made me feel, it still warms my heart. For a brief flash, I felt like I belonged. Even though 1 in 4 people worldwide lives with a mental health challenge, I mostly felt like an outsider, kind of watching billions of people laughing and having fun together without me. I'm speaking today as a member of the Stability Network, a global group of 150 people who share our stories to inspire and encourage others facing mental health challenges to thrive. So what that doctor did, that little moment where she made me feel included, it was huge. It served as sort of like a beacon, a guiding light, a holy grail, pointing toward a future where people with mental health challenges were included and unashamed. I was very fortunate because, unlike most people in the world, access to care wasn't a barrier for me. Now, access is a huge issue, and it deserves a monumental shift in attention and resources. In my case, my problems were mostly in my head, my barriers to getting well. Like a lot of people with mental health conditions, I had to climb a sort of invisible mountain. This big, huge mountain that really nobody else could see but me. There were 4 basic pitches, a pitch being like a part of the mountain it's very hard to get past, that I had to get through. The first was recognizing that I actually had a significant problem. The second was realizing there's no shame in having a mental health condition. The third was believing that people like me can and do get well and live good lives. And the fourth was realizing that asking for help can actually help. So I had to work my way through stigma and through hopelessness. Pitch number 1, realizing I had a problem. When I first got a bipolar diagnosis, I was naively kind of excited about it. I thought, wow, that's great. I'm special. So I had a mental health challenge that made me think I didn't have a challenge so much as like kind of a superpower, I guess. Because the way mania manifested for me was I would think I was kind of invincible and, oh, I'll do this amazing thing and that amazing thing. And then these things will happen. And then I'll be rich or famous or somehow fabulous because obviously. So instead of causing me to look at the possibility that I might have delusional thinking, my diagnosis kind of strengthened my belief in those delusional thoughts. And reality was not quite as supportive in terms of maintaining my delusion. And so life got harder and harder. And a couple of years later, I wound up in the hospital, as I talked about at the top of the talk. And when I was in a locked psych ward, it was really hard to deny that something had gone wrong, something was wonky. So I admitted at that point that there was at least some kind of problem, like a serious problem. And that's when I passed pitch number 1. But I still didn't get treatment because pitch number 2, I was too ashamed to admit that I had a real mental health problem. See, if I had a broken foot, nobody would expect me to fix it myself, right? Nobody would exclude me from their social circle or their workplace because I had a doctor set the bone and put a cast on it. But if I got treatment for bipolar condition or drug addiction, a lot of people would exclude me. That's stigma. I really was up against it hard. And so I didn't get treatment, and going untreated was bad for me. It caused me to become more of an outsider than I could ever have imagined. Within a year, I had pushed most of my friends away. Within a few years, my career began to wane. I went from being pretty popular in the workplace earlier in my life to realizing that most people didn't like me that much or didn't even want to work with me. And that was super painful to watch. But I was too ashamed to admit that I had a problem I couldn't fix on my own. So I really just kept going downhill. I wasn't able to keep good jobs anymore. I lost everything. And eventually I had a second invitation to stay in a mental health unit on suicide watch. Different city, different hospital, different result. This time, I healed in a totally unexpected way through the power of story. One night after dinner, I was sitting in this sterile TV/dining area with one other patient, and there was a calm honesty in the air, the comfort that comes from not having to wonder, not having to hide who you are. And she told me the story of what was going on in her life and inside of her when she drove her Jeep to the edge of the Grand Canyon and sat there revving the engine, thinking about driving over. And she told me why she didn't do that and what she was thinking she might do next in her life. I told her about my attempt, and we nodded in recognition and joked that her suicide attempt would have made a way better postcard than mine. That simple human connection made me feel like I was already awesome, just being exactly who I was. And that feeling made me so happy that the next day I went and I talked to other patients and I asked them for their stories. And as they told me, you know, I saw that they were just kind, smart, humble people with this immense inner strength built up over years of fighting what I call the war in your head. And I felt a real sense of connection and community. And I understood even then that that community wasn't me and a few people in a hospital. That community was millions and millions of people around the globe. And in the course of my 8 days there, my shame dissipated. I felt like I belonged. And when I felt the pain of depression, I thought of all the other millions of people around the planet who felt the exact same thing. And I knew I wasn't alone and I wasn't a freak. I had passed pitch number 2, getting over my shame of having a mental health condition. Pitch number 3, believing that people like me actually get better. So I did a few years later, check myself into outpatient treatment for drug addiction rehab. And I didn't have any hope that I was going to have a happy life. My goal at the time was just to live in, just to have a less painful life, which I guess sounds depressing, but that's where I was, right? I wasn't really believing happiness was available to me. And that was the first time I actually got treatment, asked for help without somebody forcing me into it or pushing me into it. So there was a little bit of hope, I suppose. But after I got clean, a couple of years later, I was as depressed and isolated as I had ever been. What motivated me to keep climbing was a story. Somebody else in recovery told me how she had had that same pain a couple years after getting clean, this horrible depression, and that she had moved through the suffering and for over a decade had been living a pretty enjoyable life. That story pierced the pitch blackness of hopelessness with a little speck of light. And it wasn't much, but it was enough to motivate me to get up and have a go at trying to maybe have a good life. I passed pitch number 3. Pitch number 4, realizing that asking for help can help. It's, in hindsight, it seems kind of obvious. I'm a little embarrassed I missed that. See, what I did was I talked to that woman. It really started one-on-one because I had heard her story. I said, all right, well, you got better. What did you do? And do you have any guidance for me? And then I met other people who had been through the same thing after they got clean. And I said, oh, really? How did that work for you? What do you do? How come you seem happy now? Do you have any advice for me? And then I talked to my doctor and asked for medical help, and I had passed. At that point, I climbed over pitch number 4, and I could see past the stigma and past the hopelessness into the possibility of having a better life. So transformation is possible. I went from living in terrible depression to having a pretty joyful life most of the time. I went from being alone and afraid to talk to people to having a really rich social life, and a big, strong circle of people who support me, and vice versa. What worked for me was I did a course of antidepressants. I was a little resistant. I told my doctor I will only do 3 months. And he said, well, we have kind of a rule of thumb. See, Seattle's a very rainy city. It's overcast most of the year. And he said, we have a rule of thumb, which is don't go off antidepressants in Seattle in the winter. That actually made sense to me. So I took my doctor's advice. I also did a course of therapy. And I put a lot of personal time and attention into mindfulness. And I'm still not very good at mindfulness, but it turns out even being bad at it is really helpful. So what I do today to manage my condition is I meditate badly. And I will drink coffee while meditating, but it really helps. I read what I call woo-woo books, things like Eckhart Tolle or Buddhist texts that help provide some relief from the churning of my thoughts and give me a little bit of distance. So when I start to get really depressed, I can usually catch it fairly early on and realize, oh, my life didn't just suddenly randomly become horribly doomed. I'm just having a depressive spell. Or if I start to get manic, I can often catch that and I'm like, whoa, I'm really manic right now. And I'll do things like I won't make any big decisions or send any fiery emails. So I still live with these things, but I've learned how to compensate. And I like to think that makes me, a little bit more like the rest of you folks who only make good choices. Another thing I do to stay well is I tell my story and I help other people tell their stories. I didn't even know storytelling was a thing, like where somebody stands up in front of an audience and tells a story. Until an ex-girlfriend who I kind of wanted to spend some time with said, oh, well, why don't we go into the storytelling event? Why don't you meet me there? And she kind of bailed at the last minute and texted me, oh, I'm not going to be there. I got a better offer. So ouch. But I went to storytelling and I stayed and I loved the stories. They were funny, sad, raw, happy, hopeful. And I decided that I was going to start telling stories about parts of my mental health journey, but with lightness and humor, because I want that conversation to be easier for people to have. And one day I was sitting in a coffee shop and somebody approached me, kind of one of those like well-groomed, fashionable people with good posture, the kind of person I'd always assumed didn't have any problems. And they looked at me and they said, hey, I just really want to thank you for your story. They had seen me tell a story. And I could see in their eyes that they were dealing with some real pain and that my story had provided connection and hope. And I saw the power of that. And I knew that I'm just one person with one perspective and one journey. Everybody, literally everybody on the planet has an equally amazing story and an equally awesome power to change other people's lives by talking about their invisible mountains. So I met a woman named Catherine Switz, and she's who started the Stability Network, which I call TSN also. And I said, hey, why don't we do a storytelling show about depression called Not Dead Yet? I explained that I thought it was kind of a funny title, specifically because I wanted to talk about mental health in a fun way. And she said, I love it. Let's do it. And so we did this storytelling event, and 6 of us told our stories. And it was really, really appreciated by the audience. And since then, Catherine has shepherded TSN into a global organization with a speakers bureau. I lead speaker trainings for them, and I also lead workshops. So if you're interested in having somebody from the Stability Network speak at your organization or event, you can visit thestabilitynetwork.org. Even though mental health causes a lot of sadness, I speak about it playfully because I want to show here's the thing. I figure people already know what their suffering is like. They don't need me to explain how that works, but I want them to see the joy that's available on the other side of that mountain. So I'm rebranding depression with a brand book that shows the life that I want people to have, the life that they want for themselves, the life they can have, not the dark life depression tells them they're doomed to have. And that's what the speakers in the Stability Network are coached to do as well, is tell people, show people the other side. And by the way, if you're interested in the Stability Network, yes, you can have us come speak, and we would love to do that. Also, you can join us and share your story to inspire and encourage others. So that woman who got me out to my first storytelling event wound up, and then bailed on me, wound up ditching me, and she ended up marrying the guy that she ditched me for. I fell in love with stories that point to a future where people living with mental health challenges can thrive. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Bill. Thank you so much. That was a great, great story. I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, the power of stories is amazing. The thing that gives me hope is that everybody climbs invisible mountains and we don't talk about them, but we can. It's like when we can start doing that, I think things will get easier. Conversations will be easier to have, and asking for help will be easier. So the power of story really gives me hope that we're moving in a good direction.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I really liked several things that you said, but especially when you started talking with just other people that have the same problem. That just opened up the whole thing. And then I was very happy to hear that you are using mindfulness and meditation also as a tool. I believe I practiced medicine for a long time. I also teach meditation, and I started meditation for anxiety and depression myself.
Oh, really?
So I would say, I'm very happy to hear that you're doing that, because I really believe it's a powerful tool for this type of thing. So I'm glad, even though badly, but everybody does it badly. We probably all do it.
I had to give up on doing it perfectly. But you're right, it really does help. And I'm glad to hear that you're finding it from a medical perspective really helpful, because it was huge in my life and still is, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think using humor helps a lot, because then that makes it easier for other people to listen to the story, to share, to talk about it, instead of just making it too serious, because then I think people find it hard to deal with that. But when you put a little bit of humor, then it's like, oh, I can relate. I can, So I think that's fantastic. I think it's a great tool. Yeah.
Well, good. Yeah, I'm glad that you appreciate that. Yeah, and I've tried it both ways. Here's the serious version, and here's the kind of like, let's laugh about it a little bit, because life is absurd. I know there's suffering, and I don't want to disrespect that, but I kind of want to honor the suffering by saying, hey, we can do something better, right? If we want to beat that suffering, let's not build a monument to it. Let's talk about the opposite of it.
Yeah, so the thing that gives you the most hope is that there is a mountain that you can all climb. Is that what you say?
Yep, people can tell their stories.
So the website is thestabilitynetwork.org. And then you also have your comedy show. And where do we find your comedy show?
You can go to stayawesome.com, and I'm doing the next thing I'm doing will be in Vancouver, BC in September, and details aren't up, but people can go there and get on my list, and I'll tell them when it's happening.
Wonderful. All right, so thank you very much. We'll probably get some questions from the audience, and then we'll put it out in a later post on the blog. But I really want to thank you so much for being here, and looking forward to seeing you soon again.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Juan. Bye.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.